Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail for a lonely life you probably wouldn't survive, perched high above jagged cliffs where the sea crashes like a wise who never learned to stop practicing, and where your only roommates are dozens of stubborn lanterns waiting to be fed oil. The air smells of brine and rust, and the dock creaks beneath your boots as you step off a supply boat that looks like it's held together mostly by prayer and leftover nails. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time in the comments. It's fun seeing where in the world you're retuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about your lighthouse is its size. It's taller than you imagined. A narrow tower clawing into the sky. The kind of place you'd think a wizard might live if wizards had union jobs and a fondness for whale oil. The walls are salt-streaked, the iron hinges orange with rust, and the door is heavier than most family secrets. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were selected for their stamina, their reliability, or simply because nobody else wanted the job. What's certain is that when you cross the threshold, you cross into a world where sleep schedules are fantasy, and lanterns multiply like rabbits. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of oil, smoke, and damp stone. There's a spiral staircase that seems to go on forever, winding like a bored snake. Each step echoes, and as you climb, you wonder whether the architect had some kind of vendetta against knees. Along the way, you pass shelves stacked with dusty journals from keepers before you. Some are full of neat handwriting, detailing fuel measurements and weather observations, while others descend into doodles of ships, or little complaints like the gulls are louder than my own thoughts. You'll come to treasure those scribbles, proof that someone else once felt the same creeping isolation. At the top of the tower sits your true responsibility, the lantern chamber. The glass is thick and curved, designed to bend light across miles of sea. But instead of one majestic flame, you discover a whole collection row after row of smaller lanterns, like a fiery congregation waiting for their sermon. You count them twice because it doesn't seem real. 40 lanterns, all demanding attention, oil, trimming, and cleaning. No one warned you about the sheer number, but apparently this particular lighthouse was over-engineered by someone who really, really hated shipwrecks. You touch one of the lanterns and immediately feel soot on your fingertips. The brass base is smudged, the wick frayed. You think about the fact that, historically, lighthouse keepers in the 19th century spent as much as 4 hours every day just cleaning glass panes. Imagine being told your job was shine light so sailors die, but actually living your job as wipe soot until your soul evaporates. And yet, that was the reality. Because even a smudge of dirt could dim the beam enough to cost lives. You can see why some keepers grew obsessive, polishing until they could see their own eye twitch reflected back at them. As evening approaches, you find yourself staring out the wide horizon. The sun is dropping like an exhausted coin, and the waves glow orange and gold. Your boots creak against the floorboards, and you know it's nearly time to start lighting. There's a little black notebook on a shelf, left by the last keeper, who quit for reasons you'd rather not investigate. Scrawled on one page is a line that makes your stomach drop. If you think you can rest once the lamps are lit, you are very wrong. You laugh nervously, hoping it was a joke, though the heavy bags under your predecessor's doodled eyes suggest otherwise. Of course, there are perks to this exile. You have the best ocean view in the world without paying coastal property taxes. On calm nights, the stars drape themselves like spilled diamonds, so bright that even the salty fog can't mute them. And every ship that sails safely past will never know the hours you spent pacing, trimming, refueling, and relighting. But you'll know, and the silence that fills the tower is both a comfort and a weight, pressing down like another layer of stone. You find yourself talking aloud just to hear a voice. Sometimes you even thank the lanterns, which might sound odd, but then again, who's here to judge? You set down your small pack in the keeper's quarters, one wooden bed, a crooked table, and a single chair that seems to resent having to support weight. On the wall hangs a faded map of the coastline, dotted with wreck sites. Some marks are neat, others scratched in haste. One in particular is so large and angry it looks like someone stabbed the parchment with their pen. Maybe it was the storm of '72, the one old sailors still mutter about in the taverns. Historians still argue whether that storm was a freak of weather or a sign of shifting ocean currents, but in either case, the lighthouse failed that night and dozens of lives were lost. You stare at that scar on the map longer than you'd like. When you finally sit down, your bones creak louder than the chair. You let out a sigh, the kind of sigh that could fog glass, and you realize this is only the beginning. The lighthouse groans in the wind. Lanterns wait silently for your hands, and the sea churns like an impatient guest. Somewhere out there, sailors are already counting on you whether they know your name or not. And in this place, your name won't matter anyway. Only the light will. The first night comes faster than you expect. The horizon swallowing the sun like a magician pulling a scarf into his sleeve. And suddenly, it's just you, the tower, and a ridiculous number of lanterns waiting for your attention. You shuffle up the spiral staircase with a can of whale oil in one hand and a bundle of wicks in the other, already wondering if you should have pursued a safer career like competitive cheese rolling or professional stamp licking. The lanterns sit in their rows, cold and stubborn, as if mocking your inexperience. You strike the first match, and the flame sputters, then steadies, casting a warm orange glow on the glass panes. The hiss of the wick catching makes you smile for a second. It feels almost ceremonial, like you're initiating the night. But then you remember there are 39 more to go, and your smile slides right off your face. Historically, keepers often lit their lamps in order, left to right, with a precision that would put most accountants to shame. You try the same, fumbling with oil and wick trim, telling yourself it's not that bad, even as sweat forms at the back of your neck. The tower fills slowly with a smoky perfume of burning oil, part comforting, part suffocating. By the time you're halfway through, your hands are sticky, your sleeves dotted with black stains, and you're humming under your breath just to keep your pace steady. You hum a sea shanty you don't really know the words to, improvising lines about gulls who owe you rent money. If anyone were here, they'd laugh or call for help. But the gulls don't mind, and the lanterns seem to burn a little brighter with your nonsense chorus. Of course, nothing goes smoothly. Lantern number 17 refuses to catch. You light it once, it flares and dies. Twice the same. By the third attempt, you're muttering threats under your breath. Like, if you don't cooperate, I'll throw you into the sea and let the crabs have you. This kind of dialogue with inanimate objects becomes a regular thing in lighthouse life. There's even a story quirky, perhaps apocryphal about a keeper in Maine who named each of his lamps after distant relatives, claiming his Aunt Beatrice always smoked too much and went out too soon. Whether that's true or not, historians still argue whether lamp failures were more often mechanical flaws or simply the result of exhausted keepers cutting corners. Either way, the battle between human and lantern is eternal. By the time you finally coax that stubborn flame to life, your shoulders ache, your knees complain, and the whole chamber is glowing like a miniature city at night. Dozens of little suns flicker in their glass homes, and for a moment you stand there, entranced. You've created this constellation, not in the sky, but here, inside stone walls, where no one will ever see it but you. The beams bend outward through the curved glass, stretching across the dark sea, slicing through fog-like spectral swords. Sailors out there won't know you're sweating through your shirt, or that you nearly lost your patience with Lantern 17. They'll just see light and steer clear of rocks that could chew their hulls to splinters. Still, there's no time to stand in awe, 'cause here's the cruel joke. Once you light them, you have to keep them fed. Oil burns down, wicks shorten, soot gathers. You shuffle back and forth with your can like a barista, serving endless cups of bitter, flammable espresso. Every so often, you wipe down the glass with a rag, cursing how fast the soot reappears, as if the lamps are producing it out of spite. You think about how keepers once kept meticulous logs of every ounce of oil used, every wick replaced, every cleaning cloth worn thin. Imagine the paperwork pages of fuel tallies that read like grocery receipts for a family of giants. Your quarters feel far away now, though they're only down a few flights of stone steps. You tell yourself you will rest in the chair for a minute once the last lamp is secure. But as you reach for the notebook to mark down the times, you realize it's already near midnight. How? You've been swallowed by routine, pulled under like a swimmer in a riptide. Your stomach growls, your eyelids sag, but the flames dance on, demanding your vigilance. You lean against the cold wall, watching shadows jump across the chamber. They look like strange creatures at play. One resembles a dog, another a crooked sailor with a crooked hat. You laugh softly, blaming fatigue. The room feels alive in ways you don't fully trust. Some lighthouse keepers, according to scattered tales, swore the lanterns whispered when the wind roared just right, voices of past watchmen muttering advice or insults. Quirky legend, sure, but after a few hours alone in the smoke, you're not entirely convinced they were making it up. Down below, the sea roars louder, a reminder that storms don't wait for human schedules. You can hear the crash of waves battering the cliffs, feel the vibration under your boots. You glance at the panes of glass, praying they'll hold. Glasswork in the 19th century wasn't always flawless bubbles, ripples, weak spots. Historians still argue whether the famous failure of the Eddystone Lighthouse lantern panes in 1881 was due to shoddy manufacturing or the sheer force of the storm. Either way, the idea of those panes bursting while you're stuck inside makes you shiver. The hours crawl, each one marked by the ritual of checking, trimming, refilling. Your body begs for rest, but you push on, because if even one lantern goes out, you'll hear about it in the morning F. Not from the inspectors, then from the echoing guilt in your own head. You try sitting, only to pop back up a minute later, certain that number 23 is dimming. Spoiler, it isn't. Your brain just doesn't know how to trust darkness anymore. When dawn finally teases the edge of the horizon, you feel like you've aged 10 years. Pale light leaks into the chamber, soft and forgiving, revealing the smudges on your face, the oil stains on your trousers, and the crusted soot on your hands. You snuff each lantern one by one, carefully, respectfully, as though you're putting children to bed. Except instead of fairy tales, they've been listening to your muttered complaints about sore feet and bad coffee. The chamber grows dim, the flames shrinking to wisps, until the last ember dies and the glass cools. You descend the stairs on shaky legs, each step an argument with gravity. The keeper's quarters smell faintly of mildew, but the bed looks like salvation. You collapse onto it, boots still on, your body buzzing with exhaustion. Somewhere outside, gulls scream as if mocking you, reminding you that sleep won't come easy here. Not with their racket and the promise of tonight waiting on the horizon again. You close your eyes anyway, whispering to yourself, one night down, forever to go. The wind picks up just as you start to doze, rattling the windows and shaking the tower like a giant with a sense of humor, and your half-conscious mind immediately snaps awake. Out at sea, dark clouds march with a deliberateness that seems personal. A slow invasion of the horizon, and your stomach tightens as you remember that this lighthouse, despite its many lanterns, is sometimes the only thing standing between sailors and the cruel, jagged teeth of the coast. Storms were the real tests, and you're about to discover why lighthouse keepers were called the guardians of light. Not because it was glamorous, but because their nerves had to be made of something tougher than leather. You clamber up the spiral staircase once more, the air thick with the smell of oil and salt, and check each lantern in turn. They sway slightly with the increasing wind, glass panes rattling as though complaining about being left alone in the first place. You adjust wicks, refill reservoirs, and mutter encouragements that sound ridiculous even to your own ears. A historian might note that lighthouse keepers often went months without seeing another human being, surviving on routine and, in some cases, hallucinating conversations with the lamps themselves. You wouldn't be surprised if that becomes you, especially tonight. The first wave slams against the cliffs with a roar that makes the tower vibrate, and you can feel it through your boots. The wind carries spray inside, tiny droplets catching in the light, turning the chamber into a miniature storm of its own. You lean against the brass railing and watch the horizon, squinting to discern the shadow of a ship riding the incoming swells. Your heart skips, not with excitement, but with the heavy responsibility of knowing that any misstep, any lantern that falters, could be catastrophic. There's a reason keepers' manuals were thick and heavily annotated. The rules of light and distance were unforgiving. A precise geometry between glass, flame, and ocean. Yet, in the chaos, there's a strange beauty. The wind whistles through cracks in the masonry, creating an eerie, almost musical harmony with the crash of waves below. The storm throws sheets of rain across the glass, making the lantern's beams bend and scatter, kaleidoscopic and hypnotic. You laugh softly, shaking your head at how utterly terrifying and mesmerizing it all is. Fringe tales speak of keepers who claimed the lights danced for them in patterns, almost as if the sea itself were taking notes. You doubt it's true, but in this moment, it feels plausible. Historians still argue whether such stories were coping mechanisms for isolation or genuine glimpses of atmospheric oddities. Your hands are slick with oil and rainwater as you trim wicks, shaking slightly from both exertion and adrenaline. One particularly stubborn lantern refuses to cooperate, sputtering and then dying entirely. You curse under your breath, not at the glass or wick this time, but at the timing. Now, right when the storm is peaking, you have to coax it back to life. There's a rhythm to the dance tilt the wick. Add a little oil, strike, shield the flame from gusts but. Tonight the rhythm seems intent on mocking you. You mutter apologies, threats, and a tiny pep talk that sounds like, "Come on, buddy." Sailors are counting on you, and so am I. Meanwhile, the lighthouse itself protests. Wooden floors creak, iron fittings shudder, and a stray pane of glass rattles in its frame. You pause, hand on the railing, listening to the tower's voice. You think about how, historically, lighthouses were constructed to withstand incredible weather. But no amount of design can anticipate the weariness of the human keeping them. Sometimes the structure outlives the people, sometimes it breaks them first. You find yourself wondering if this tower has witnessed keepers thrown into despair by storms, lantern failures, or the unyielding loneliness that comes with the job. Maybe that's why so many previous logs contained nothing but meticulous fuel tallies and vague, desperate doodles. The storm rages, and you start checking each lantern every 15 minutes, tracing your steps like a ritual. The wind howls around the tower, bending the panes with invisible hands, and the sea foams with violent insistence. From up here, you can see nothing but black waves dotted with whitecaps, like broken porcelain floating in a night that refuses to end. You remember reading that in 19th-century storm records, certain lighthouse stations reported near-constant maintenance throughout violent nights, with keepers describing the work as a dance with madness and flame. You understand that sentiment perfectly. Your body aches. Your clothes are soaked, your hair plastered to your head, and your gloves slick with oil. Every step seems heavier than the last. Still, the lights must hold. You repeat the process mechanically, almost hypnotically, one lantern after another, feeding them oil, adjusting wicks, shielding flames. Occasionally, a tiny ember leaps into the brass reservoir, and you jump back, heart racing, whispering a frantic apology to the fire. You think about how some keepers develop superstitions. Never turn your back on a flame. Always speak kindly to the lanterns. Never trim wicks without a prayer. You try a small, muttered, "Please behave," just to be safe. At one point, you glance down the staircase and see shadows dancing wildly in the lantern light. The spirals, the brass, the foggy glass panes, they create illusions that might be ghosts, might be tricks of the storm. You smile, imagining telling a modern friend about the spectral lighthouse choir singing to keep you awake. Fringe historians argue whether these sightings were hallucinations induced by isolation, wind, and candle fumes, or if some keepers genuinely glimpsed phenomena beyond ordinary explanation. Tonight, you do not care about skepticism. Shadows and light play together like children, and you are happy to watch. Hours stretch. The storm doesn't relent. You have memorized the location of every lantern in the chamber, the quirks of each wick, the stubborn tendencies of some flames. Your logbook sits open nearby, empty except for timestamps and notes like Lantern 22 refuses to accept logic. The sea continues to pound, waves hurling themselves at the cliffs as if challenging your authority. You mutter jokes at the wind, pretending it can hear you, while simultaneously trembling at the sheer power of nature unleashed. Finally, a lull. A subtle one, but enough to feel it in your bones. You glance at the horizon, seeing black water still churn, but a faint line of silver appears at the edge. The storm is passing. You take a deep breath, oil-streaked, exhausted, and let yourself imagine the relief that awaits the sailors out there. Perhaps, someday, they'll never know the small miracles you perform in darkness. The hours spent coaxing light into life while waves try to steal it away. For tonight, you have held the line, and the lighthouse stands unwavering. A sentinel against chaos, and you, despite sore muscles, wet clothes, and frayed nerves, feel a quiet, smug victory. Morning arrives like a timid guest, soft and gray, diffusing itself across the horizon as if the storm never happened. You descend the spiral staircase, still sticky with oil and damp from the storm spray, to face the endless chore list awaiting you. Cleaning, polishing, inspecting tasks that sound simple until you actually live them. Today, the brass fittings gleam dully, windows fogged and streaked with salt, and the floorboards are littered with soot, each speck a reminder of the previous night's battle with flame and wind. You trudge through, broom in hand, wondering how so much dirt can accumulate in a single night, and secretly suspect the lanterns themselves might be conspiring to soil the place while you sleep. The lighthouse chamber smells like burnt oil, salt, and damp stone, a combination that will become strangely comforting over time. You scrub glass panes, polish brass collars, and sweep floors, noting that the lighthouse S-stone spiral seems to gather grime in corners that defy logic and physics. At some point, you catch yourself talking to the mop as if it's a council of advisors, muttering, "Do it right, or the sea will know." Quirky anecdotes from other keepers float into your mind. One reportedly invented a system of pulley-driven brushes that supposedly cleaned the windows without his help, only to find the brushes had wandered off into the fog. Historians still argue whether that story is fact, exaggeration, or the result of too many long nights alone. You choose to believe it's possible. Sweeping and polishing requires near ritualistic attention. Even a thin smudge on a pane could dim the light's reach by miles, potentially changing the course of a ship. You pause mid-polish to imagine a sailor out there, squinting into the dark, trusting that your efforts are enough to guide him past jagged rocks. The thought is oddly soothing, despite the monotony. You can't see the ships, but knowing that your labor protects life adds a strange, weighty dignity to what is otherwise an absurdly tedious existence. You picture yourself in future histories, the keeper whose hands smelled perpetually of oil saved countless lives, though never a single sailor knew his name. The anonymity suits you. By mid-morning, the lamp reservoirs demand attention again. Oil has settled, wicks shortened, and soot has returned like a familiar ghost. You climb the spiral staircase, each step reminding you that your body has limits you are continually ignoring. One lamp, number 27, refuses to cooperate. You tap the glass, wiggle the wick, and eventually have to strip it down and rebuild it, cursing under your breath about the audacity of inanimate objects. Fringe lore tells of keepers who developed nicknames for their stubborn lamps, treating them as mischievous pets, and you consider following suit. Lantern number 27. Meet the uncooperative brat. Lunch is a cold affair, if you can call it that. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and a cup of lukewarm tea that tastes faintly of brine, thanks to a vent you failed to notice. You eat while seated on the narrow window ledge, staring out at the sea, watching gulls wheel and dive as if mocking your breakfast choices. Despite the bland fare, there's a rhythm to these moments. The wind, the waves, the distant calls of other keepers' signals far off the coast, if you're lucky enough to hear them. You marvel at the endurance required to remain stationed here for weeks at a time, sometimes months, without meaningful conversation. Letters home exist, yes, but they are infrequent, delayed, and never fully capture the odd mixture of terror and tranquility that is lighthouse life. After eating, it's back to polishing. Every brass handle, hinge, and pulley must shine, not for vanity, but because maintenance is survival. Rust spreads faster than you anticipate. Salt attacks every metal surface, and a neglected lantern could become a death trap. You hum again, making jokes to the shadows, performing mental calculations about whether the oil you have will last the week. Sailors' journals often noted the precision required in these calculations, which could mean the difference between guiding a ship safely to harbor and witnessing disaster. You appreciate the irony that such minute details the waxy buildup on a hinge, the tilt of a wick hold enormous stakes. By mid-afternoon, fatigue presses into your bones, reminding you that humans weren't designed to work endlessly under the pressure of wind, rain, and isolation. You take a moment to sit, letting your back press against the cold stone wall, listening to the distant crash of waves. The rhythmic roar is oddly soothing, a heartbeat that anchors you, while the lanterns stand sentinel above. You remember stories of keepers who claimed they could predict storms by listening to the sea's tone, subtle variations in the crash and hiss, a sixth sense honed by necessity. Historians still argue whether these auditory observations were scientific or mere superstition. But tonight, you find yourself listening with a mixture of reverence and dread. Soon, it's time to trim wicks again. The process is oddly intimate, the wax and flame responding to your careful touch. You watch as the tiny flicker steadies, dancing against the glass, proud and defiant against the stormy backdrop. Sometimes the lamp flares unexpectedly, and you jump back, cursing while smiling. The kind of nervous humor that comes from exhaustion. Fringe tales suggest that some keepers saw human-like faces in the flames, smiling, frowning, judging, but you tell yourself it's just your imagination. Still, a brief glance convinces you otherwise. The light seems to acknowledge your effort. A silent nod that tonight's vigil continues. The afternoon stretches onward. You polish, sweep, refill, adjust, and inspect, occasionally pausing to note minor repairs for later. The tower groans in protest, iron twisting slightly in the warmth of the sun after the storm. Stone shifting subtly, a reminder that your isolated fortress is alive in its own way. You talk softly to the walls and windows, muttering apologies for the previous night's frantic storm management, and for some reason, it feels necessary. The lighthouse has personality, and you've quickly learned that acknowledgement keeps spirits yours, and perhaps its own intact. By early evening, a second storm brews on the horizon, low and threatening, reminding you that your work is unending. Lanterns must be checked again. Glass must be polished, oil measured and topped. You glance down the staircase and note the strange shadows stretching across the walls, elongated by the fading sun. For a moment, you imagine them as visitors, distant echoes of previous keepers who never left. Some left scribbles, names, cryptic messages scratched into stone, reminders that solitude is a shared condition even across decades. You trace a faint mark with your finger, smiling at the continuity of human experience in a place that seems impervious to time. Night falls, and you light the lanterns for the second time today, moving through each one with practiced hands, checking for flaws, ensuring every flame reaches its intended brilliance. You are exhausted, shoulders aching, muscles sore, yet there is a strange pride in the completion of the routine. The tower glows warmly against the dark sea. A beacon, not just for sailors, but for yourself, proof that you have survived another day. The lighthouse doesn't just guide ships, it grounds you, giving structure and purpose to an existence that could easily dissolve into fog and isolation. You pause briefly at the chamber's top, letting the steady glow wash over your features. Whispering to yourself, I made it through, for now. The next morning arrives with a bureaucratic subtlety, not with the drama of a storm, but with the stiffness of visitors in starched collars. Inspectors are coming, 2 of them, appearing out of the fog like ghosts in formal suits, notebooks in hand. Pens poised as if the slightest misstep could cost you your post. You trudge to the door, wiping hands on your oil-stained trousers, wondering why exactly they can't just trust that the lights work, that the oil burns, and that the sea is still being watched. Historians still argue whether inspections were designed primarily to improve safety or to assert authority. But you suspect a little of both and that neither side truly enjoyed the process. You open the door, and the chill of morning hits you like a slap. The men step inside with calculated care, boots echoing in the spiral staircase, eyes scanning every brass fitting, every glass pane, every smudge that you swore would have disappeared overnight. Morning, gentlemen, you say, voice tight from anticipation and residual sleep. They barely nod, already scribbling in their notebooks. One mutters something about lamp efficiency, while the other pokes at the brass railings like a curious cat testing gravity. Their tiny gestures make you realize you're simultaneously a tour guide, a janitor, and an unwilling stage actor. You escort them up the stairs, each step echoing more than usual, as if the tower itself is aware of the scrutiny. The lantern chamber awaits, rows of small flames bobbing in unison, proof that you've survived countless hours of soot, oil, and your own trembling hands. You watch their eyes sharp, critical, and unwavering as they inspect each lamp. They lift reservoirs, twist knobs, sniff the wicks. You can help but notice that one of them is trying not to sneeze from the lingering smoke, a human detail that makes the tension oddly endearing. Fringe accounts suggest that some inspectors were nearly as feared as the storms themselves, wielding clipboards like weapons, and tonight, you understand why. Questions come precise and relentless. Are the wicks trimmed exactly to specification? How many ounces of oil per lamp tonight? Have you noticed any soot accumulation beyond expected levels? You answer carefully, remembering that in 19th-century lighthouse manuals, these details were recorded with near-religious devotion. One minor slip, one misstatement, and your reputation could wobble like a candle flame in a gust. You find yourself exaggerating slightly about the speed of lamp ignition, hoping they don't peek too closely at your logs, which are peppered with marginal doodles and faint curses directed at uncooperative lanterns. As they move from lamp to lamp, you catch a glimpse of shadows dancing on the walls, distorted by the lantern light. You try not to think about previous keepers who claimed to see shapes, faces, or even animals moving in these shadows. Quirky tales insist some lights developed personalities over decades of solitary watch, guiding, scolding, or consoling their human keepers. Historians still argue whether these stories are the product of isolation-induced hallucinations or something more mysterious. You prefer to chalk it up to fatigue, though you catch yourself whispering, "Be good," to a particularly stubborn lamp. The inspectors pause at lantern 17, the one that gave you trouble during last night's storm. You hold your breath as the first man adjusts the wick, tilts the reservoir, and nods approvingly. Relief floods you, but you keep your expression neutral. They move on, checking the spiral staircase, inspecting floorboards for rot or grit, running fingers along brass fittings as if determining your moral character from metal sheen. You smile faintly at the absurdity, imagining this exact scene recorded in some Victorian guidebook with a title like "How to Survive the Gaze of the Stern Inspector." Mid-inspection, they ask you about your daily routine, timing, and emergency protocols. You launch into a measured description, emphasizing your vigilance, the sequence of lamp lighting, and your preemptive measures for stormy nights. It feels like reciting a script you've memorized over hours of endless preparation. Though a small part of you wonders if the inspectors are human or cleverly disguised ghosts here to torment you. Stories suggest that some inspectors actually tested keepers by staging small emergencies, like covering a lamp pane and observing response time. You hope this is not one of those days, as your nerves are still raw from last night's storm. A sudden squawk of a gull outside breaks the tension. You glance at the window and notice its silhouette against the gray morning light, wings spread like an accusatory finger. You chuckle softly, imagining the bird as a fellow inspector, silently judging your housekeeping. Fringe folklore has it that gulls often served as informal critics, signaling shifts in wind or alerting to impending ships, or simply adding a bit of absurd commentary to the isolation. Historians still argue whether the bird behaviors were genuine indicators of weather or sailors' superstitious embellishments. You decide it doesn't matter, and you enjoy the mental image of the gull giving a tiny nod of approval. Inspection concludes, finally, with a walk back down the staircase. The men scribble in their notebooks one last time, nod politely, and mutter that they'll be sending their report. You know it's likely to include some minor critique about wick maintenance or polish sheen, but you're secretly proud. Not a single lamp went out, not a single pane shattered, and your hands, though blackened and stiff, have survived unscathed. The tower feels almost like an old friend now, stretching and settling back into silence, as if recognizing the temporary presence of outsiders. Once the inspectors depart, you collapse into the nearest chair, a victory sigh escaping your lips. The smell of oil, rain, and sea still lingers, but it no longer feels oppressive. You sip a cup of tea, imagining that the logbook they will receive reads more like a heroic tale than a mundane report. You reflect on how these visits punctuate your life, small disturbances that remind you of the world beyond the lighthouse, where people walk, talk, and experience normal schedules. Here, you have isolation, responsibility, and the endless companionship of flames. And you wouldn't trade it for anything, not even for slightly less scrutiny. Evening arrives, as it always does, bringing the familiar ritual of lighting the lanterns. You move through the chamber with newfound confidence, knowing that today you've passed a test of more than just skill. Endurance, patience, and resilience. The lamps flare to life in orderly succession, casting their glow over the dark water, their beams cutting through the dimming light like swords. You notice the reflections on the wet stone walls, the shadows of your own movements stretching long and thin. A reminder that you are alone, but not invisible, even if the world doesn't know your name. As night settles, you lean against the brass railing, surveying the row of lanterns now all alight, a fiery army standing guard against the sea. Your mind wanders briefly to the inspectors, imagining them recounting this day with meticulous detail, unaware of the storm you battled. The fatigue that gnawed at your bones, or the small jokes you whispered to Lantern 17 just to coax it into compliance. Fringe accounts suggest that some keepers forged subtle alliances with their lanterns, naming them and talking to them as though the inanimate could truly respond. You do the same tonight, whispering a quiet thank you to each flame. The sea beyond roars softly, calmer than last night, but no less commanding. You notice the tiny flickers of distant lighthouses, each performing the same laborious vigil, and feel a shared kinship. An unspoken bond of those chosen or, perhaps, cursed to keep light against darkness. Historians still debate the social impact of these isolated posts, whether they strengthened communities or simply created islands of obsession and loneliness. For now, it doesn't matter. You are here, alive, attentive, and part of a tradition that stretches back decades, centuries even, where light means life and vigilance is everything. You finally sit in the chair, exhausted, legs aching, hands blackened from repeated polishing. Your eyes wander across the chamber, watching the lamps burn steadily. And you whisper promises to yourself that tomorrow you will rise, clean, polish, and maintain. Because the sea never rests, and neither, in some sense, can you. Isolation, scrutiny, labor, this is the rhythm of life at the lighthouse, and you have proven that you can endure it. The lamps stand as silent witnesses, flickering slightly in approval, and for a moment, the weight of solitude feels like something almost sacred. By mid-morning, the echo of the inspector's boots has faded, leaving the lighthouse wrapped in its usual solitude, a kind of quiet that presses gently against your eardrums and settles deep into your bones. You trudge down the spiral staircase, hands still damp from oil and rain, carrying a small bundle of letters you've been meaning to write. Writing home is both a comfort and a torment here. Pen scratches across paper like a compass, searching for direction. But words feel too small to capture the breadth of isolation, the ceaseless demands of lanterns, and the ceaseless crash of waves. You wonder if the people who receive these letters will ever really understand, or if the letters will simply sit in a drawer, a faint scent of brine and oil marking your presence. You unfold the first sheet of paper and begin hesitating as your mind races through the day's chores. The ink smudges slightly under your thumb, a reminder that even in correspondence, the lighthouse exerts its stubbornness. You describe the storm, the flaring lanterns, and the relentless wind as best you can, peppering in small jokes about the uncooperative gulls and lamps that act like mischievous children. You tell yourself that humor is necessary, a salve for your frayed nerves. Fringe reports from other keepers suggest that many letters home contained elaborate fictions, exaggerating dangers or inventing visitors to make the isolation more interesting. Historians still argue whether this was deception or a creative outlet, but you suspect it's a bit of both. Outside, gulls wheel in the sky like impatient traffic, calling sharply and occasionally diving too close for comfort. You pause to watch one land near the supply shed, wings fluttering in a haphazard ballet, and you smile despite yourself. The birds are constant companions, unofficial neighbors who know your comings and goings better than anyone else. In fact, some keepers believed the gulls served as a form of social interaction, their squawks translating into a secret language of critique, advice, or friendly mockery. You mutter a small apology to the flock for being late with your letters, imagining them nodding sagely. As the morning stretches onward, you immerse yourself in writing. You note small victories, each lantern lit perfectly, each pane scrubbed to gleaming clarity. You describe the strange solitude, the way shadows crawl across the stone walls in the afternoon sun, how the lighthouse seems to breathe along with the wind. Your pen moves faster, a rhythm that feels almost like chanting, and you realize the act of recording your thoughts is a comfort nearly equal to the flames themselves. In fact, fringe tales tell of keepers who carved portions of their letters into the stone walls when ink ran out, leaving messages for future inhabitants. Some historians still argue whether these carvings were practical or devotional, but you imagine a faint trace of kinship, if you ever encountered such a mark. Lunch comes quietly, a repetition of yesterday's modest meal. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and the occasional sip of tea that tastes faintly of the sea. You eat while sitting by the small porthole, watching waves crest and break like the frozen motion of a distant audience. The isolation lends a strange intimacy to these mundane acts, the chewing and swallowing heightened by the vast emptiness surrounding you. You imagine that sailors out at sea are also eating, perhaps not the same meal, but performing the same simple, necessary rituals of survival. The thought connects you across miles of water, a reminder that solitude is shared in ways you cannot fully perceive. After lunch, you return to your letters, but your attention wavers. You glance at the shelves lined with previous keepers' journals, their pages filled with meticulous observations, doodles, and occasional venting. One in particular catches your eye, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "The sea laughs at me. I return the courtesy in oil and flame." You chuckle softly, recognizing the sentiment as something you have felt yourself, a combination of irritation, awe, and reluctant respect. Fringe stories suggest some keepers imagined the ocean as a living entity, a demanding but dignified neighbor. Historians still argue whether this was poetic license or genuine belief, but you can feel the truth in it as the wind rakes against the tower walls. After a long pause, you resume writing, this time reflecting on human connection or the absence thereof. You describe the letters themselves as lifelines, thin and fragile. Traveling days or weeks to reach loved ones who may not understand the work, the monotony, or the strange satisfaction of preserving light against encroaching darkness. You confess in ink to fleeting moments of frustration, the kind that bubble up in whispers to the lanterns and walls, but vanish in daylight. You add a joke about the official lighthouse therapist, a gull who insists on perching on your shoulder while you write, offering unsolicited critiques with its piercing squawk. By late afternoon, you pause and lean back against the wall, stretching your arms and noticing the soft scent of oil lingering in the air. The letters are complete, envelopes stuffed and sealed, waiting for the next supply boat to carry them away. There is relief and completion, a sense of sending part of yourself beyond the stone walls and iron fittings, beyond the gulls and lanterns, into the hands of someone who will recognize you as a person rather than merely the guardian of light. You marvel at the human desire to communicate, to leave traces, to be remembered, even in the smallest ways. You rise and inspect the lanterns, the ritual never-ending. Each wick trimmed, each reservoir checked, and the flames now flicker with newfound steadiness, like children reassured by a familiar routine. The chamber glows warmly against the growing shadows outside, and you realize that even in isolation, structure provides comfort. The flickering light seems almost to applaud your diligence, acknowledging your effort to balance human vulnerability with mechanical precision. Fringe stories from other lighthouses describe lamps that responded to careful attention, burning steadier when treated kindly, an idea that modern scholars debate with skepticism. Tonight, you feel it is true. Evening arrives, carrying with it the usual ritual, lighting the lanterns for the night watch. You move through the chamber with careful, measured steps, hands steady despite the fatigue of the day. Each flame ignites, small and fierce, bending light outward to the dark sea. You whisper reassurances, gentle commands, and occasionally tiny jokes as the beams stretch across the waves, creating a living web of guidance. The sea, restless and vast, rolls beneath its voice, both companion and adversary. Historians still argue whether the night watches were primarily for the protection of ships or for the keeper. Sone's sense of order, but you understand that the two are inseparable here, bound by flame and responsibility. As night deepens, you settle into the chair near the window, observing the lantern's steady glow. The letters you wrote sit neatly stacked, symbols of connection and memory, tangible proof that life exists outside the tower. The wind whispers through cracks, carrying the faint scent of salt and distant storms. And you feel both small and significant, a single human against immense forces, holding light against darkness. You murmur a soft thank you to each flame, to the gulls, and even to the tower itself, acknowledging the shared existence that sustains you in the endless rhythm of lighthouse life. The following morning greets you with the muted sigh of fog rolling in from the sea, softening the jagged cliffs and dampening the sound of the waves crashing below. You step outside the keeper's quarters, boots squelching in the wet, and inhale the briny air, letting it fill your lungs like an uninvited but familiar guest. Today, the work begins not with crisis, but with careful maintenance, a series of chores that seem deceptively simple until you actually engage with them. You trudge toward the lantern chamber, noticing how the damp settles into every nook and crevice, reminding you that the lighthouse is alive in its own subtle, unyielding way. You begin with the brasswork, wiping the railings, collars, and hinges until they shine in defiance of salt and age. Oil stains your fingers, blackening your palms, and yet you find satisfaction in the gleam, as if each polished surface is a small victory over entropy itself. Fringe accounts from other keepers describe similar rituals, claiming that attention to these details was not only practical, but almost meditative. Historians still argue whether these obsessive habits were survival strategies or a quiet rebellion against isolation. And as you continue scrubbing and polishing, you feel both sides of that debate pulsing in your mind. The lanterns themselves demand attention next, rows of small flames waiting patiently or stubbornly for their feeding. You trim wicks, refill reservoirs, and adjust the positions of each flame so that the light will stretch across the water efficiently. The work is repetitive, meticulous, and exhausting, yet it holds a hypnotic rhythm, a cadence that carries your thoughts outward across the waves. You recall tales of keepers whose hands moved almost instinctively after years of service, performing complex sequences with minimal thought. For you, it is an acquired skill, balancing precision with endurance, a dance between human frailty and mechanical fidelity. By mid-morning, fatigue begins to set in. Your shoulders ache, your back groans, and your legs feel like they are carrying extra weight. You pause to lean against the cold stone, taking in the view through a fog-soft window. The horizon is a gentle gray, indistinct and infinite, and somewhere out there, a ship glides along the unseen currents, trusting in the invisible guidance of your labor. You imagine the crew on board, unaware of the hours you've spent trimming wicks and polishing brass, and for a moment, the anonymity of your work feels profoundly satisfying. You are the unseen lifeline, a guardian of flame against a dark, indifferent sea. As the morning stretches onward, you move to sweeping the spiral staircase, the rhythmic scraping of broom against stone filling the tower with sound and, curiously, comfort. Each step reveals hidden grit, dust, and remnants of soot from previous nights, and you find yourself muttering apologies to the unseen builders who constructed the lighthouse with slightly uneven masonry. Fringe legends describe keepers who believed the spiral staircase had a personality of its own, occasionally playing tricks by hiding grime or subtly shifting underfoot. Historians still debate whether such beliefs were superstition or simply imaginative coping strategies in extreme isolation. But you hum along, indulging the idea for your own amusement. By midday, you pause for a modest meal of salted meat and hard biscuits, washed down with lukewarm tea that tastes faintly of the sea. Sitting by the porthole, you watch gulls wheel lazily above the cliffs, their calls echoing through the fog. You think about how these creatures have witnessed every storm, every visitor, every keeper who has come before, and you feel an odd kinship with them, small observers who judge nothing but observe everything. Some keepers swore that the gulls communicated weather changes, signaling danger or calm through subtle flight patterns. Historians still debate the validity of these observations, but today, you find yourself reading meaning into every swoop and squawk, a quiet dialogue between species that no one else witnesses. Refreshed and mildly fortified by the brief meal, you return to the lantern chamber. Today, you focus on minor repairs, tightening brass collars, straightening panes, and checking for leaks in oil reservoirs. The lanterns respond to your attention, flames steadying and flickering with a soft, loyal consistency. Fringe tales claim that some lamps developed preferences, burning steadier for certain keepers or reacting to gentle murmurs. You chuckle quietly, whispering to one particularly cooperative flame, "Good work, old friend," and swear for a fleeting moment that it nods back. Historians still argue whether these anecdotes reflect actual phenomena or the keeper's psyche imposed upon inanimate objects, but the comfort they provide is undeniable. Afternoon drifts in with a slow, inevitable weight. The fog thickens outside, turning the distant cliffs into vague, gray silhouettes. You climb the spiral staircase to check on every lantern once more, noting slight variations in flame height and oil consumption. Attention to these minute details is both exhausting and satisfying. Your focus narrows to the rhythms of light and flame, to the whisper of wind against the glass, to the occasional cry of a distant gull. You consider the oddity of this life, how hours can pass both slowly and impossibly fast. Each moment a mixture of monotony and intense responsibility. By late afternoon, a storm begins brewing on the horizon. Subtle at first, a ripple across the water, a gentle hiss of wind through cracks in the tower. You pause to watch it grow, realizing that tonight's labor will be both familiar and daunting. You brace for repetition, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, tending to glass panes, and listening intently to the behavior of the sea. Fringe tales suggest that some keepers believed lanterns had moods, responding more sluggishly to inattentive care and more eagerly to kindness. Historians still debate the nature of these anecdotes, but tonight you approach each flame with a reverence bordering on ritual, whispering encouragements as the wind begins to press harder against the tower walls. Evening settles into night, and you light the lanterns in preparation for the first watches of the coming storm. Your hands move with careful precision, each flame igniting, steadying, and bending across the waves. You pause to admire the warm glow filling the chamber, the intricate dance of shadows across stone and brass. The sea below roars with growing intensity, a reminder of the ceaseless challenge that awaits you. You whisper to the lamps, to the tower, and even to the gulls outside. A private conversation acknowledging your shared effort. The storm is approaching, but tonight you feel ready, alert and oddly, alive in a way that only this life can provide. The storm arrives in earnest, just as the horizon surrenders to night. The wind shrieking against the tower and tossing waves like angry fists at the cliffs below. You climb the spiral staircase, each step slick with residual rainwater and a fine layer of salt, and reach the lantern chamber, where 39 small flames await your attention. Your muscles ache from repetitive tasks earlier in the day, but fatigue is irrelevant now. Each lantern must burn steadily or risk sending a ship to a grim fate. You think fleetingly about alternative careers: librarian, pastry chef, perhaps a professional napper, but none seem plausible against the unrelenting call of duty that defines this strange, luminous existence. You begin with lantern 1, trimming the wick and adjusting the reservoir. It flares slightly before steadying, a reminder that these flames have temperaments, quirks, and demands of their own. Fringe lore from old keepers tells of lamps that fought at times, flickering rebelliously unless treated with respect. And you whisper a half-joke to the flame, hoping humor counts as diplomacy. Historians still argue whether such accounts are exaggerated storytelling or manifestations of fatigue-induced hallucination. But tonight, you are willing to believe every word. The wind rattles the glass, panes like impatient fingers, and you brace them with your palms, listening to the hiss of flame against storm. The chamber fills with a thick, oily aroma of burning whale oil, comforting and suffocating in equal measure. You work methodically, feeding each lantern, checking the reservoirs, trimming wicks with precise motions honed through repetition and necessity. One particularly stubborn flame refuses to cooperate. You tap the glass lightly, mutter apologies, and finally coax it into steady obedience. In that moment, the flame's warm glow seems almost grateful, and you imagine a conversation. "Thank you for your patience," you whisper. Fringe accounts from other lighthouses speak of keepers who believed their lamps communicated silently, offering approval or disapproval, and you feel a quiet kinship with these unseen predecessors. As the storm intensifies, the tower groans in protest. Stone walls flex imperceptibly, iron railings hum, and the floorboards creak under your shifting weight. You pause briefly to rest, leaning against the wall and taking in the chaotic symphony of wind, rain, and crashing waves. The sound is terrifying and mesmerizing at once, a reminder of the raw power that surrounds you. Some historical accounts suggest that early lighthouse builders deliberately designed towers to sing during storms, using vibrations to warn keepers and alert them to structural stress. Historians still debate whether this intentional design or serendipity. But tonight, the eerie harmony of creaks and hisses feels purposeful. Every few minutes, you check the lanterns again, a ritual that blends vigilance with obsession. Oil levels fluctuate, wicks shorten, and soot accumulates at a pace that seems almost conscious. Your hands are sticky and blackened, gloves useless against the residue. But you continue, knowing that each flame is a lifeline stretched across the darkness. You glance toward Lantern 17, the one that has tested your patience for days on, smile faintly. It holds steady now, obedient as if recognizing your relentless care. You whisper a congratulatory joke. Good boy, you finally decided to behave, and feel a small sense of triumph. The storm rages harder, waves crashing with fury against jagged rocks. You peer through the curved panes, watching the sea surge and roll. Imagining ships navigating these treacherous waters guided by your light, the responsibility presses heavily on your chest. One moment of inattention could be catastrophic. Fringe tales recount keepers who fainted from exhaustion during violent nights, only to have the lamps continue to burn as if the tower itself had absorbed human frailty. Historians still argue whether such accounts are factual or embellished, but you feel the weight of their plausibility in every tremor of the floor beneath you. Your body aches, exhaustion clawing at limbs that were already sore from a day's labor, but there is no pause long enough to indulge weakness. Every lantern demands attention, every wick trimmed, every reservoir checked. You hum softly under your breath to maintain rhythm, an improvised shanty about lamps that refuse to cooperate and gulls who provide unsought commentary. Humor becomes a lifeline in itself, a mental buoy against the relentless roar of the storm and the oppressive solitude of the tower. Some keepers reported speaking to the lamps in earnest, naming them, cajoling them, even scolding them, claiming the ritual improved performance. You are no different. Hours stretch into an almost unmeasurable continuum. The storm's intensity varies, waxing and waning, and your mind oscillates between alertness and weariness. You catch fleeting shadows in the chamber, cast by the swaying flames and the flickering reflections on wet panes. They appear almost sentient, morphing into faces, animals, and impossible geometries. Fringe stories suggest that lamps remembered previous keepers, projecting echoes into the room during long nights. Historians debate whether these were hallucinations or an early psychological response to extreme isolation. For you, the boundaries blur. The shadows feel both threatening and companionable. Midnight approaches, and you begin to feel a strange rhythm set in. The waves crash. The wind shrieks. The lamps burn steadily, and you move through the chamber, part human, part caretaker of flame. You pause to observe each lantern, noting subtle shifts in flame behavior, minor puddles of oil that need mopping, and occasional streaks of soot that threaten clarity. You feel a peculiar intimacy with the light, a connection forged through effort, patience, and near-infinite repetition. The storm continues outside, but within the chamber, the light persists, a testament to persistence and quiet defiance. Finally, a lull in the storm allows you a brief moment to breathe. Leaning against the railing, sweat and oil on your skin, eyes tired but alert. The horizon is a dark gray, indistinct, yet hints of calm begin to shimmer in the distance. The lanterns glow warmly, an army of small, defiant suns against the chaos, each flame a personal victory. You whisper gratitude and half-jokes to the flames, acknowledging the silent partnership you've formed tonight. Historians still argue about the psychological effects of long-term isolation on keepers. But tonight, you recognize a profound resilience within yourself, a hard-won mastery over both light and fear. By early morning, the storm recedes to distant rumbles, leaving a softened post-storm gray over the water. You descend the spiral staircase, muscles sore, hands blackened, but pride warming your chest. Each lantern performed, each wick trimmed, each reservoir filled, your labors endured, your vigilance unbroken. Outside, the gulls wheel above the cliffs, watching silently, perhaps in judgment, perhaps in camaraderie. You stretch in the pale, wet light, imagining the ships that survived the night, guided by nothing more than your perseverance, your attention, and the stubborn loyalty of 39 small flames. The morning after the storm dawns, fragile and muted. Sunlight struggling through a thick layer of mist that clings to the cliffs and the lighthouse like a reluctant companion. You step outside, boots squelching in the lingering puddles, and take in the scene. Foam-streaked waves receding, gulls calling from precarious perches, and a strange serenity left in the storm's wake. Your muscles are sore, shoulders stiff, and yet you feel a quiet satisfaction. The lanterns above continue to burn steadily, undisturbed by the chaos they survived, a testament to both human diligence and the enduring stubbornness of brass and glass. You trudge back inside, bracing yourself for the chores that follow a never-ending cycle of maintenance, observation, and meticulous care. First on the list is cleaning. You move from lantern to lantern, wiping soot from glass panes, polishing brass collars, and checking for any signs of water intrusion that the storm may have forced through cracks. The smell of oil mixes with the faint scent of wet stone and sea spray, an aroma that has become almost comforting despite its pungency. You hum quietly to yourself, an improvised tune to keep spirits lifted, and imagine telling a modern audience about the strangely hypnotic effect of repetitive labor. You probably won't survive this style humor, though tempered with a sleepy laugh. Fringe tales claim that some keepers swore their lamps emitted different personalities after a storm, flaring brighter or flickering cautiously, and you pause, noticing subtle differences in flame behavior. Historians still argue whether such observations were valid or merely the product of fatigue-induced imagination. Next, you check oil reservoirs and wicks. A minor miracle occurs. All lamps ignite with minimal coaxing, flaring warmly, obedient as if acknowledging your care during the previous night's ordeal. You smile faintly, muttering congratulations and a joke about being the world's least appreciated flame whisperer. The task is mundane yet essential, and you move systematically, each action a blend of muscle memory and meticulous attention. The history books describe 19th-century keepers performing these tasks with mechanical precision. But few capture the mental gymnastics required to remain calm, while knowing that a ship's safety hinges on your labor. Mid-morning stretches in a rhythm punctuated by brief moments of reflection. You sit by the porthole, sipping lukewarm tea, observing the gulls dive and wheel in the softened sunlight. You reflect on isolation, on the strange camaraderie between humans and seabirds, and on the letters you've sent to distant loved ones, hoping they capture even a fraction of this life. Some fringe anecdotes suggest that keepers wrote elaborate fictions into correspondence, inventing visitors or dramatizing storms to entertain those on the receiving end. Historians debate whether this was an artistic outlet or deception, and you shrug to yourself, content to admit it is a little of both. You return to the lantern chamber to inspect every flame. Lantern 17, your longtime nemesis, behaves admirably, flaring softly in acknowledgement of your presence. You whisper a gentle joke. Finally, you've learned to behave and feel a curious sense of camaraderie with the inanimate. The chamber smells of warm oil, soot, and damp stone, comforting in its constancy. You adjust the mirrors, ensuring beams reach the full radius they are supposed to, and check for slight variations in flame height. Fringe lore recounts keepers who claimed their lamps communicated gratitude through subtle brightness shifts. Historians remain skeptical, yet in the dim, smoky light, you swear the flames acknowledge your effort. Lunch is cold and simple, a repetition of yesterday. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and tea that tastes faintly of sea spray. You eat while perched near the porthole, watching waves recede and sunlight scatter across the fog. You imagine sailors navigating these waters, relying entirely on the steady glow of the lighthouse you tend, never knowing the human effort behind it. The monotony of sustenance feels oddly comforting, a small anchor in the ceaseless rhythm of lighthouse life. You marvel at how small axe-trimming wicks, polishing brass, writing letters can hold immense weight in unseen worlds. Afternoon brings minor repairs. You tighten loose screws, check for leaks, and polish each lantern's brass fittings until they gleam. The tower seems almost alive, groaning under your footsteps, vibrating subtly as wind stirs beyond the stone walls. Fringe stories suggest that the tower itself can communicate with attentive keepers, vibrating to signal potential danger or structural stress. Historians debate whether such accounts are factual or poetic exaggeration. You smile faintly, listening to the subtle hum of stone, imagining it offering encouragement, a quiet reminder that vigilance is necessary and rewarded. By mid-afternoon, the fog lifts slightly, revealing glimpses of cliffs, distant ships, and the rhythm of the tides. You climb the spiral staircase to ensure the upper lanterns remain in perfect order. The process is methodical. Trim wick, refill reservoir, adjust flame, check glass. Repetition becomes meditative. Your hands move almost instinctively. You recall stories of keepers who went months without human contact, conversing with lanterns, birds, and even the stone walls. Historians still debate whether this was a form of psychological coping or spiritual communion, and you find comfort in imagining a little of both. Evening approaches with a gentle inevitability. You light the lanterns for the night watch, moving through the chamber with care and precision. Each flame ignites cleanly, a tiny sun piercing the growing darkness, casting shadows that stretch long and thin across walls of stone and brass. The sea beyond churns softly, waves still restless from the storm, but subdued. And you whisper a few jokes and reassurances to the flames, a dialogue that has become habitual, comforting, and necessary. Fringe tales suggest that the lamps remembered attentive keepers, burning steadier as a form of silent recognition. Tonight, you feel their acknowledgement. Night deepens, and you settle near the railing, surveying the glowing chamber and listening to the distant lullaby of waves. Your muscles ache, your hands are blackened with oil, but your mind feels steady, focused, and oddly proud. The horizon stretches into darkness, punctuated only by faint, flickering points of distant lighthouses. You feel a quiet kinship with the invisible network of keepers, all performing the same labor of vigilance, maintaining light against darkness, protecting life from unseen hazards. Historians still argue about the social and psychological effects of long-term isolation on keepers. But tonight, you feel the profound value of purpose, connection, and resilience in your bones. Morning creeps in slowly, filtered through a thin curtain of fog that drapes itself over the lighthouse like a hesitant visitor. You rise with a stiff groan, muscles complaining about the night storm and the hours spent coaxing lanterns into obedience. There is a peculiar rhythm to your body, a memory of yesterday's labor encoded in every tendon, every joint. You stretch, yawning, and the faint smell of sea spray and lingering oil fills your nostrils. Even in the solitude of this stone tower, life continues. Gulls wheel overhead, waves crash against the cliffs below, and the lighthouse itself seems to exhale in slow, deliberate pulses, a breathing monument to vigilance and persistence. Your first task is inventory. Oil barrels, wicks, and cleaning supplies, each accounted for with meticulous care. You move through the storage room, occasionally muttering jokes to yourself about the absurdity of counting fuel like a miser hoarding gold. Fringe stories suggest that some keepers developed intricate rituals around inventory, including secret markings or coded logs that only they could interpret. Historians still debate whether these behaviors were survival mechanisms or simply eccentric habits. But you indulge the possibility, sketching tiny symbols in the corner of a ledger as you count. Even the mundane becomes sacred in the isolation of lighthouse life. Once inventory is complete, you begin the ritual polishing of brass fittings. The steady scrape of cloth against metal filling the chamber with a rhythm almost meditative in its constancy. Oil stains blacken your fingers, and yet you find satisfaction in the gleam that emerges. Proof that effort yields tangible results. You pause occasionally, leaning against the railing to watch the horizon through fogged glass panes. Ships are invisible now, but you imagine them, trusting entirely in your labor. Fringe accounts suggest that keepers sometimes claimed they could feel approaching vessels by subtle changes in wind or light reflections. A sixth sense honed over months of isolation. Historians still argue whether these stories were mythologized or factual. But tonight, you allow yourself to believe. Mid-morning brings lamp maintenance, a process both tedious and essential. Each wick is trimmed, reservoirs checked, and glass panes inspected for tiny imperfections that might distort or diminish light. Lantern 17, your perennial adversary, behaves predictably today, burning steadily in acknowledgement of your attentive hands. You whisper a congratulatory joke, imagining it grinning back at you in flickering light. Fringe lore from other lighthouses suggests that certain lamps responded better to humor and gentle coaxing, while others demanded stern attention. You consider that you have perhaps learned to speak their language, if only through patience, repetition, and subtle observation. By late morning, the fog begins to thin, revealing jagged cliffs and the restless sea below. You step to the porthole, taking in the panorama, feeling a simultaneous thrill and exhaustion. The wind bites, carrying scents of salt and damp stone, reminding you that nature is both companion and adversary. You recall historical accounts describing lighthouse life as a delicate balance between human control and submission to elemental forces, and you nod silently in agreement. Fringe anecdotes suggest some keepers would mark weather changes with small stone cairns along cliff edges, a ritualistic act of observation and communication. Historians debate the intent and accuracy of these markings, but you consider leaving a small token outside yourself, a secret acknowledgement to future keepers. Lunch is simple: hard biscuits, salted meat, and tea that tastes faintly of brine. You eat near the porthole, watching the gulls dive and wheel in the pale sunlight. They are constant companions, critical observers of your labor, and occasional comic relief. Fringe tales claim gulls once guided lost keepers back to their towers in fog, though historians still dispute the reliability of such anecdotes. You smile at the thought, imagining a feathered concierge silently judging your housekeeping skills. Solitude and absurdity blend seamlessly here. Laughter, a small, necessary rebellion against the relentless seriousness of flame and stone. Afternoon brings routine inspections and minor repairs. You climb the spiral staircase, checking each lantern, each mirror, each brass hinge. Small adjustments here, a drop of oil there, a careful scrub of soot. And grime, these actions are a continuous dialogue between you and the lighthouse, between human intention and mechanical fidelity. Fringe accounts suggest that some lamps remembered caretakers, burning steadier or more obediently for those who treated them with care. Historians argue the validity of these claims, but you hum softly, feeling the veracity in every flicker. As evening approaches, clouds gather on the horizon, signaling the possibility of another storm. You prepare early, trimming wicks, topping reservoirs, and double-checking each flame. The lanterns ignite smoothly, one by one, casting a warm glow that slices through the creeping darkness. Shadows stretch long and dance across stone and brass. A private performance for which you are both audience and director. You whisper encouragement to the flames, jokes about gulls, and gentle apologies for any past neglect. Fringe stories speak of lamps forming subtle patterns in flame that communicated warnings or messages to attentive keepers. Tonight, you notice slight variations in height and brightness, interpreting them as acknowledgments, silent applause, or quiet warnings. Night settles in fully, wind picking up as waves crash against the cliffs with increasing fury. You sit near the railing, shoulders aching, hands blackened with oil, and gaze at the endless horizon. The lanterns burn steadily, a constellation of fire standing vigil over the dark sea, each flame a small sun against the vast indifference beyond. You think of the ships that rely on this light, the unseen sailors guided safely past treacherous rocks, and you feel both pride and humility. Historians debate the social significance of keepers' solitude, whether it was necessary discipline or cruel isolation. You no longer question it. The work, the light, the responsibility are their own justification. Hours pass in quiet rhythm. Check flame, adjust wick, polish brass, whisper jokes to lantern 17, not at lantern 39. Hum to yourself. Time becomes fluid, neither measured by hours nor minutes, but by flame flicker and wave crash. You recognize the strange intimacy of this work, the solitude, the repetition, the physicality of caring for light, the silent partnership with stone, metal, and flame. Fringe accounts speak of lamps rewarding attentive keepers, and tonight, you swear each flame burns a little brighter, acknowledging your dedication. Finally, as midnight approaches, a rare lull falls. The horizon softens, waves rolling gently, wind easing slightly, and you lean against the railing, savoring the brief respite. The lanterns glow steadily, warm against the dark, and you whisper thanks and soft jokes to each one. You think about the lineage of keepers who have performed these same tasks, decades or centuries past, and feel a quiet kinship stretching across time. This is life at the lighthouse. Isolation, vigilance, small triumphs, quiet humor, and an unwavering bond with the persistent, loyal flames that light the darkness. Dawn arrives in a muted wash of gray and gold, creeping through the fog like a shy visitor that refuses to announce itself fully. You rise from a brief, uneasy rest, shoulders stiff and muscles sore from yesterday's storm and last night's vigil. The lanterns, now dimmed by the morning, flicker softly, still warm from continuous care. You trudge down the spiral staircase, boots slapping lightly against damp stone, to inspect supplies. Barrels of oil, stacks of wicks, and bundles of cleaning cloths are arranged in their usual order, waiting silently, their utility unappreciated but indispensable. Fringe stories claim that some keepers developed an almost devotional attachment to their oil stores, treating each barrel as sacred, and you feel a little of that reverence as you check levels. Historians still debate whether such behaviors were eccentric, superstition, or practical discipline. You move to the lantern chamber, inhaling the familiar scent of oil, soot, and sea. Each flame requires individual attention, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, and ensuring the glass panes are streak-free. Lantern 17, ever the troublemaker, flares unpredictably before calming, eliciting a faint, exasperated laugh from you. Humor has become a crucial tool in isolation, a way to bridge the gap between human vulnerability and mechanical fidelity. Fringe accounts tell of keepers naming their lanterns, conversing with them in whispers, cajoling them, scolding them, and even apologizing for negligence. Historians still debate whether these anecdotes reveal psychological coping mechanisms or simple folklore. You indulge the ritual anyway, whispering, "Good morning, old friend," as Flame 17 steadies. Mid-morning is dedicated to structural checks. You move along the spiral staircase, running your hands along the stone walls, listening to subtle shifts and vibrations. The storm from days past has left its mark in minute cracks and slick patches that demand your vigilance. Fringe legends speak of towers that singed under pressure, humming softly when structural integrity was threatened. Historians still argue whether these were auditory hallucinations induced by stress or intentional design features. You pause, listening to the wind whistling through tiny crevices, imagining the tower communicating in faint, deliberate pulses. There is reassurance in ritual, in careful observation, and in the sense that you are attuned to both the lighthouse and the unpredictable elements surrounding it. By late morning, your attention shifts to correspondence. Letters awaiting dispatch sit stacked neatly, ready to journey across seas to loved ones or distant officials. Writing has become both catharsis and accountability, a way to impose human order on an otherwise isolating environment. You describe the storm, the lantern's behavior, the subtle quirks of certain flames, and your own oscillating moods with gentle humor and vivid imagery. Fringe tales suggest that some keepers invented fantastical events in letters, partly to entertain recipients and partly to stave off monotony. Historians still debate whether such exaggerations undermine historical accuracy, but for you, the act of writing provides clarity and connection. Lunch is modest. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and a cup of tea that carries a faint tang of salt and stone. You sit near the porthole, gazing at the soft gray waves and imagining distant sailors relying on your vigilance. A pair of gulls wheel in the wind, squawking criticisms you pretend to understand. Fringe accounts suggest that gulls sometimes served as unintended assistants, alerting keepers to approaching weather changes or ships. Historians remain skeptical, but in moments like this, you'll allow yourself to enjoy the idea of feathery coworkers silently supervising your work. The solitude feels less oppressive when shared, even imaginatively, with creatures so familiar yet untouchable. Afternoon brings routine maintenance, cleaning soot from glass panes, adjusting mirrors, tightening brass fittings, and polishing lanterns. Your hands are blackened with oil, fingers stiff from repetitive motions, but the rhythmic repetition is oddly soothing. Fringe stories claim that lanterns responded to care, flaring steadier or dimming depending on attentiveness. Historians argue whether these observations were factual or subjective interpretation, but the psychological impact is undeniable. You find comfort in believing that the flames recognize your effort, that your vigilance is acknowledged, even if silently. By mid-afternoon, fog has thinned, revealing cliffs, rocks, and distant waves dappled with sunlight. You climb the spiral staircase for a full inspection of upper lanterns, checking mirrors, reservoirs, and wicks with precise care. Repetition becomes meditative. The sway of the tower, the subtle shift of light on glass, the creak of stone beneath your boots. The lighthouse seems alive, responsive to touch and attention, an entity existing alongside you. Codependent in a delicate, unspoken partnership. Fringe tales describe previous keepers imagining conversations with the tower itself, its stone walls offering guidance or judgment. Historians debate the veracity of such claims, but you hum quietly, feeling a subtle, comforting resonance in the echoes of your movements. Evening descends with a slow inevitability. Clouds gather on the horizon, hinting at rain or perhaps another storm. You light the lanterns for the night watch, moving methodically, ensuring each flame burns cleanly, bright and steady. Shadows stretch across the chamber in playful distortions, as if teasing you, yet you meet them with humor and patience. Fringe accounts suggest keepers occasionally read messages or omens into shadow patterns cast by lantern light. Historians remain skeptical, yet tonight the shifting silhouettes feel meaningful. Subtle reminders of attention, patience, and the unseen forces you work alongside. Night deepens. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. You sit near the railing, shoulders aching, hands blackened, eyes tracing the horizon. The lanterns burn steadfast, a constellation of fire standing guard against the dark, indifferent sea. You think of the ships guided safely past hidden rocks, of the unseen sailors depending entirely on these tiny suns, and you feel a quiet mix of pride and humility. Historians debate the psychological effects of long-term isolation on keepers, but tonight you feel nothing but purpose, focus, and connection, entwined with flame, stone, the eternal rhythm of waves. Hours pass in meticulous ritual. Trim wick, refill reservoir, polish brass, adjust mirrors. Whisper jokes to lantern 17, nod to lantern 39, hum softly. Time becomes abstract, measured by flicker and wave, not hours or minutes. The intimacy of work, the solitude, and the connection with the inanimate become profound. Fringe stories speak of lamps rewarding care. Tonight, each flame burns just a little brighter, a subtle, comforting acknowledgement. You sit, listening to the wind and sea, feeling a lineage of keepers and countless nights of vigilance stretching backward through time, a network of light and dedication. Dawn arrives gradually, brushing the edges of the lighthouse with soft light that struggles through lingering fog, painting everything in muted silver and gray. You rise from a brief rest, muscles stiff from yesterday's night watch and the subtle soreness of constant movement. The smell of oil and sea mingles in the air, a familiar companion that never fully leaves. You trudge down the spiral staircase, boots echoing against stone, to inspect supplies, barrels of oil, stacks of wicks, bundles of cleaning cloths, all arranged neatly, yet silently demanding attention. Fringe stories from other keepers claim some developed almost reverent routines around their supplies, treating barrels like sacred objects. Historians still debate whether this was eccentricity or survival instinct, but for you, each barrel, each wick, each cloth is essential to maintaining order against chaos. You move into the lantern chamber, inhaling the warm, oily scent as you prepare for morning maintenance. Lantern 17, your familiar troublemaker, flares briefly before calming into steady obedience. You whisper a half-joke to it, imagining it grinning back at you in flickering light. The other lanterns hum their quiet consistency, responding to your careful attention. Fringe accounts suggest some lamps had preferences or personalities, burning more reliably under attentive care or dimming when neglected. Historians remain skeptical, debating whether these observations were literal or symbolic. But you indulge the belief, finding reassurance in the idea of a subtle, responsive partnership with inanimate light. By mid-morning, you move to the spiral staircase and walls, checking for moisture, minor cracks, and any signs of stress from recent storms. You run your hands along the cold stone, listening to subtle vibrations as the wind presses against the tower. Fringe legends recount keepers believing towers communicated, humming warnings or encouragements. Historians still debate the validity of these tales, but for you, the structure seems alive in a quiet, reassuring way, responding to careful attention and respect. You pause, noting the gentle sway of the tower under gusts, a reminder of both its strength and vulnerability. Late morning is dedicated to correspondence. Letters awaiting dispatch sit stacked neatly, ready to carry news, humor, and reflection to distant loved ones or officials. Writing is both catharsis and discipline, a way to structure your days, express frustration or amusement, and maintain a connection to humanity beyond stone walls. Fringe stories suggest some keepers invented elaborate tales to entertain recipients or themselves, embellishing storms or inventing visitors. Historians debate whether this undermines historical accuracy, but you enjoy the creative outlet. You describe the lamps, the gulls, the subtleties of wind and sea, weaving humor into careful observations. Lunch is simple: hard biscuits, salted meat, and tea with a faint tang of salt and stone. You perch near the porthole, watching gulls wheel above the cliffs, imagining them as your silent coworkers. Fringe tales suggest gulls sometimes warned keepers of incoming weather or ships. Historians remain skeptical, yet you indulge the thought, smiling at the notion of feathered assistants quietly supervising your labor. The fog outside begins to lift, revealing jagged cliffs, the restless sea, and distant ships. Solitude feels less oppressive when shared imaginatively with these creatures, tiny sentinels in the vast gray expanse. Afternoon brings meticulous maintenance, scrubbing soot from glass panes, adjusting mirrors, tightening brass fittings, and polishing lanterns until each gleams. Your fingers are stiff, blackened with oil, but the repetition has a hypnotic, meditative quality. Fringe stories speak of lamps that responded to attentive keepers, flaring steadier or more obediently. Historians debate whether these claims were literal or symbolic, yet you feel undeniable comfort in the belief. Each flame becomes a partner, a co-guardian of light, a testament to patience and care. By mid-afternoon, the sun breaks further through the clouds, revealing cliffs, jagged rocks, and foaming waves. You ascend the spiral staircase for an inspection of upper lanterns, checking reservoirs, mirrors, and wicks with methodical precision. Repetition has become ritual. The sway of the tower, the subtle reflections of light, the soft creak of stone underfoot. The lighthouse seems alive, responsive to touch and attention, an entity coexisting with you in delicate, unspoken symbiosis. Fringe tales speak of keepers imagining conversations with the stone, walls offering guidance or judgment. Historians debate accuracy, yet you hum quietly, finding comfort in subtle resonance. Evening approaches, clouds gathering on the horizon as potential storms loom. You prepare early, lighting lanterns one by one with careful attention, ensuring each flame burns steadily. Shadows stretch long across the chamber, dancing playfully. Fringe accounts suggest keepers sometimes interpreted these shadows as messages or omens. Historians are skeptical, yet tonight the shifting silhouettes feel meaningful, reminders of vigilance, patience, and unseen forces in your life. You whisper jokes and encouragement to Lantern 17, nod to Lantern 39, and hum softly. Maintaining a delicate dialogue with light. Night deepens, wind rising again, waves crashing against cliffs. You sit near the railing, shoulders aching, hands blackened, observing the endless horizon. The lanterns burn steadfast, constellations of fire guarding against darkness. You think of ships guided safely past hidden rocks, unseen sailors relying on your vigilance, and feel pride, humility, and purpose entwined. Historians debate the psychological effects of long-term isolation on keepers. But tonight, you feel focus and connection, entwined with flame, stone, and the rhythm of waves. Hours pass in meticulous ritual, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, adjusting mirrors, humming, whispering jokes. Time becomes measured by flicker and wave, not minutes or hours. The intimacy of work, the solitude, and the connection with inanimate objects, tower and flame, become profound. Fringe stories speak of lamps rewarding care. Tonight, each flame burns brighter, a subtle acknowledgement. You feel a lineage of keepers stretching backward through time, each night of vigilance linking you to those who came before, a network of light, labor, and dedication. In these hours, the lighthouse is both a prison and a sanctuary. Its demands exacting yet comforting. Its isolation a mirror reflecting resilience, humor, and unwavering attention. The dawn is a pale whisper across the horizon. Soft gray light bleeding through the lingering fog, revealing the cliffs and restless sea in subtle shades of silver. You rise with the stiffness of muscles long used to repetitive motion, carrying the aches of yesterday's storm and last night's vigil. The scent of oil, damp stone, and salt air hangs in the tower, a constant reminder of your work and its intimate connection to the natural world. You descend the spiral staircase, boots clicking lightly against stone, toward the storage room to inspect supplies, barrels of oil, neatly stacked wicks, and bundles of cloth waiting for use. Fringe stories speak of keepers treating these supplies with almost religious reverence, marking them carefully, speaking to them, or even performing small rituals to ensure their efficacy. Historians still debate whether these practices were practical, eccentric, or psychological coping strategies. But you find value in careful order, comfort in the predictability of material objects in a world otherwise dominated by chaotic elements. In the lantern chamber, you begin morning maintenance, moving systematically from lantern to lantern. Lantern 17, ever the reluctant participant, flares before settling into a steady flame under your practiced hands. You whisper a gentle joke, imagining the lamp responding with a shy acknowledgement. The other lanterns hum quietly, as if satisfied with their caretaker's diligence. Fringe lore suggests that certain lamps develop preferences, responding differently to various keepers or moods. Historians debate the literal truth of these claims, but tonight, You allow yourself to accept the comforting narrative that these small flames are sentient in a way beyond mere combustion. The routine trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, polishing glass provides a rhythm, a meditation, and an invisible tether to the world beyond your isolation. Mid-morning is devoted to inspecting the tower itself. You run your hands along the stone walls, feeling subtle vibrations as the wind presses against the structure, listening for faint creaks and hums that might signal weakness or wear. Fringe accounts from other keepers suggest towers communicate when stressed, producing subtle sounds or sensations to alert caretakers. Historians debate whether these reports are folklore or early architectural intentionality, but your own perception of the stone as living and responsive is hard to dismiss. Each observation is a conversation, a dialogue between human and masonry, where care, attention, and respect are translated into subtle understanding. By late morning, you turn to correspondence, letters stacked neatly on the table, ready to be sent to distant loved ones or officials. Writing becomes both catharsis and discipline, a structured activity in an otherwise unpredictable life. You describe the storm, the lamp's temperament, the play of light on fog and cliffs, and the subtle humor of gulls wheeling above the tower. Fringe anecdotes claim some keepers invented elaborate tales for their letters, embellishing events or inventing companions to stave off boredom. Historians debate the veracity and purpose of these embellishments, but you embrace the creative outlet, finding that humor and narrative sustain both mind and spirit. Lunch is modest and routine. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and tea with a faint Thames tone. You perch near the porthole, watching the gulls wheel overhead, imagining them as silent collaborators in your work, subtle co-guardians of the lighthouse. Fringe tales suggest that gulls sometimes signaled approaching weather or ships, a natural intelligence used by isolated humans. Historians remain skeptical. Yet today, the idea feels plausible, even comforting. A reminder that connection is possible beyond walls and stone. Afternoon is devoted to meticulous maintenance of the lanterns. You scrub soot from glass panes, adjust mirrors, tighten brass fittings, and polish lanterns until their surfaces gleam. Your fingers are blackened with oil, stiff from repetitive motions, yet each action is rhythmic, meditative, and purposeful. Fringe stories claim that attentive care influences lantern performance. Flames burning steadier or more obediently for diligent keepers. Historians debate the plausibility, but you feel an undeniable connection between care and consequence. A small, intimate understanding of cause and effect within this isolated ecosystem of flame and stone. By mid-afternoon, the fog thins, revealing jagged cliffs, distant waves foaming against rocks, and the soft glint of sunlight on water. You climb the spiral staircase for inspection of upper lanterns, checking mirrors, reservoirs, and wicks with methodical care. Repetition becomes meditative, the swaying of the tower, subtle reflections of light, and creaks of stone underfoot forming a rhythm that steadies both body and mind. Fringe accounts suggest previous keepers imagined conversations with the tower itself, with the stone walls offering guidance or judgment. Historians debate accuracy, yet you hum quietly, drawing reassurance from subtle vibrations and echoes, interpreting them as approval of your diligence. Evening approaches with a slow inevitability. Clouds gather on the horizon, hinting at another storm or drizzle. You prepare early, lighting the lanterns for the night watch, ensuring each flame burns steadily and cleanly. Shadows stretch across the chamber, playful and strange, as if performing their own silent choreography. Fringe accounts suggest keepers sometimes read messages or omens into shadow patterns cast by lantern light. Historians are skeptical, yet tonight the silhouettes feel meaningful, reminders of vigilance, patience, and unseen companionship. You whisper jokes and encouragement to Lantern 17, nod to Lantern 39, and hum softly, maintaining a subtle, delicate dialogue with the light. Night deepens, the wind rising, waves crashing against cliffs. You sit near the railing, shoulders aching, hands blackened with oil, observing the horizon stretching into blackness. The lanterns burn steadfast, constellations of fire guarding against the indifferent darkness. You think of the ships guided past hidden rocks, unseen sailors relying entirely on your vigilance, and feel pride, humility, and purpose intertwined. Historians debate the psychological effects of long-term isolation on keepers. But tonight, you feel focus and connection, entwined with flame, stone, and rhythmic waves. Hours pass in meticulous ritual, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, adjusting mirrors, humming, whispering jokes. Time becomes abstract, measured by flicker and wave, not minutes or hours. The intimacy of work, the solitude, and the connection with inanimate objects, the tower and the flames, becomes profound. Fringe stories speak of lamps rewarding care. Tonight, each flame burns brighter, a subtle acknowledgement. You feel a lineage of keepers stretching backward through time, nights of vigilance linking you to those who came before, a network of light, labor, and dedication. The lighthouse is both sanctuary and challenge, its isolation demanding humor, resilience, and unwavering attention to the delicate balance between human and elemental forces. The dawn arrives slowly, pale and hesitant, brushing the tower in soft shades of gray that mingle with the lingering fog. You rise with a familiar stiffness of muscles, still bearing the after-effects of long nights and repetitive movements. Shoulders sore and back tight from spiral staircases, lantern maintenance, and storm vigilance. The smell of oil, wet stone, and salt air greets you as a constant companion, the essence of your life entwined with flame and sea. You descend carefully to inspect supplies, noting barrels of oil, stacks of wicks, and bundles of cloth, each waiting silently for attention. Fringe accounts suggest that some keepers regarded these supplies almost as sacred, marking or talking to barrels as if they were allies. Historians still debate whether such behavior was practical or eccentric. But you find comfort in the routine precision of inventory. It is both control and reassurance in a life otherwise governed by the unpredictable elements. You move into the lantern chamber, inhaling the warm, oily scent, and begin morning maintenance. Lantern 17, your stubborn companion, flares briefly before settling into steady compliance. You mutter a gentle joke, imagining it responding, and move on to the others, checking wicks, reservoirs, and mirrors with methodical care. Fringe lore from distant lighthouses claims that lanterns have personalities, reacting differently to keepers' moods or approaches. Historians debate the truth of these claims, yet you indulge them, finding solace in the idea that your labor is acknowledged, however subtly, by the flames. The rhythm of trimming, refilling, polishing becomes meditative, a tangible ritual that ties you to the tower, to history, and to unseen sailors who will rely on these lights. Mid-morning is dedicated to structural inspection. You run your hands along the stone walls, feeling subtle vibrations as wind presses against the tower, listening to creaks and groans that might signal strain. Fringe accounts tell of towers communicating when stressed, producing subtle noises or sensations to alert attentive keepers. Historians debate whether these stories are factual or folklore. But tonight, the tower hums a quiet reassurance under your touch. You move carefully, checking for leaks, damp patches, or loose fittings. The act of listening, of reading stone and wind, has become second nature, a dialogue that shapes both your labor and your perception of time. By late morning, attention shifts to correspondence. Letters awaiting dispatch sit in neat stacks, ready to journey across oceans to loved ones or officials. Writing is both outlet and discipline, a structured way to impose human narrative upon isolation. You describe the lamp's behavior, the play of light on mist and waves, and occasional humorous observations of gulls overhead. Fringe accounts tell of keepers inventing stories or exaggerating events to entertain themselves or recipients. Historians debate whether such embellishments obscure history or reflect genuine human adaptation. But you embrace the creative outlet, blending humor, detail, and reflection into each note. Lunch is modest. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and tea tinged faintly with brine and damp stone. Perched near the porthole, you watch gulls circle and dive, imagining them silent collaborators in your work. Fringe tales suggest gulls sometimes provided early warning of weather changes or approaching ships. Historians remain skeptical, but you indulge the idea, finding comfort in these imagined alliances. The fog continues to lift, revealing jagged cliffs, foaming waves, and distant sunlight glinting off water. Isolation feels less oppressive when shared imaginatively with creatures as constant and attentive as these feathered companions. Afternoon is devoted to lantern maintenance, scrubbing soot from glass panes, adjusting mirrors, tightening brass fittings, and polishing lanterns to a gleam. Your fingers are blackened and stiff, but repetition becomes meditative. Fringe stories suggest attentive care influences flame steadiness. Historians debate the plausibility, but you feel undeniable connection and consequence in each action. Lanterns become partners, each a tiny guardian of light, proof that careful labor yields results. Mid-afternoon, sunlight peeks through clouds, illuminating cliffs, rocks, and foaming waves. You climb the spiral staircase for a full inspection of upper lanterns, checking mirrors, reservoirs, and wicks. Repetition now has rhythm. Tower sways, light reflects, stone cricks, symphony of order and subtle motion. Fringe accounts describe keepers imagining conversations with the tower, walls offering guidance or judgment. Historians debate accuracy, yet the subtle vibrations and echoes are reassuring. Their quiet feedback affirming your diligence. Evening arrives, clouds gathering on the horizon. You prepare early, lighting lanterns for night watch, ensuring each flame burns cleanly and bright. Shadows stretch long, forming distorted dances across the chamber. Fringe tales suggest messages or omens in these patterns. Historians remain skeptical, but tonight, shadows feel meaningful. Reminders of patience, vigilance, and unseen forces at play. You whisper jokes to Lantern 17, nod to 39, hum softly, maintaining your dialogue with light. Night deepens, wind rises, waves crash. You sit near the railing, shoulders aching, hands blackened, eyes tracing the endless horizon. Lanterns burn steadfast, constellations of fire guarding against darkness. Ships rely entirely on these tiny suns. Unseen sailors' safety rests on your vigilance. Pride, humility, and purpose intertwine. Historians debate long-term isolation effects, yet tonight you feel only focus, connection, and the rhythmic interplay of flame, stone, and sea. Ritual care and humor keep time, measured by flicker, wave, and echo. The lighthouse is sanctuary and challenge, demanding resilience and constant attention, yet rewarding patience, subtle observation, and humor in small, luminous increments. The sea is restless tonight, its voice deeper and more insistent, booming against the cliffs like a conversation you're not invited to interrupt. You stand at the top of the spiral stair, lantern chamber warm with the mingled glow of dozens of flames. Each wick has been trimmed, each pane polished, every reflector adjusted until the chamber itself hums with a golden steadiness. There's satisfaction in that, though it's tinged with the familiar ache of fatigue that sits in your bones like a tenant refusing to leave. The beams cut outward in arcs, reaching beyond the fog, promising safety to sailors you'll never meet. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers thought of themselves as part of the community they served or as detached hermits of the coast. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, but as the beams stretch outward, you feel tethered to a world far beyond your stone tower. You lean into the railing and watch as the fog curls like smoke across the water. It drifts in great rolling waves, swallowing and revealing fragments of sea as if deciding what to show and what to hide. Fringe lore claims some keepers read fog-like handwriting, discerning moods and messages in the density and motion of vapor. Historians debate the credibility of such claims, but standing here tonight, you can't help but see shapes and patterns. A curtain that parts, a doorway that closes, a stage set for unseen players. You blink, shake your head, and remind yourself that sleep deprivation has been known to make keepers imagine far stranger things. Descending the spiral for a late round of inspection, you feel the weight of the tower shift with the gusts outside. The stone hums, echoing with subtle vibrations that run through your fingertips when you touch the wall. Fringe accounts insist towers sometimes sing to their keepers, offering warnings in resonance or in creaks of strain. Historians remain unconvinced, though many admit that lonely ears, sharpened by silence, hear what others would ignore. Tonight, the tower hums like a low cello, reassuring and steady. You whisper thanks to the stone, then continue downward, oil can in hand, ready to feed whichever lantern seems hungriest. In the quarters, a kettle rattles faintly on the iron stove. You pour steaming water over a handful of dried leaves, the scent sharp and earthy, filling the room with comfort. The table bears the marks of years of meals, notes, and restless tapping fingers. You sit, sip, and glance at the logbook open before you. The pages bear steady handwriting, neat columns of numbers, notes about wind, tide, and flame. But every so often, squeezed into margins are human touches. Small doodles, tired remarks, jokes left like crumbs for a future you. One reads, "Seagulls louder than thunder, still less annoying than visitors." You chuckle into your cup, remembering your own irritated scribbles about gulls a few weeks ago. Continuity stretches across the pages, binding you to strangers long gone, each of you part of a relay race of light. When the tea is gone, you climb back up. Each turn of the staircase feels longer than the last. Your legs weighted not just by fatigue, but by the knowledge that this will repeat tomorrow and the day after, until someone else takes your place. Fringe stories suggest some keepers carved secret marks into the stone to prove they'd existed here. Historians debate whether these are idle vandalism or desperate attempts to anchor identity. You run your fingers over a faint scratch initials. Nearly worn away end. Wonder what that keeper felt when they cut their mark. If it was triumph, despair, or simple boredom. At the top, the lanterns greet you with steady fire. Lantern 17 flickers briefly, as though remembering its usual mischief, then straightens obediently under your watchful eye. You laugh softly, mutter a comment about its inconsistency, and feel oddly comforted by its quirks. One flame among many, yet it carries its own personality in your mind. Fringe tales say keepers who spent decades with their lamps swore certain lanterns recognized them. Historians argue the case, but to you, the notion feels right, because to labor this long in solitude, you have to grant personality to things that burn and shine and stay with you through the night. As midnight drifts closer, you lean against the window, watching waves pound the rocks below. Spray shoots upward, catching stray beams of lantern light, glittering briefly before falling back into darkness. For a moment, the scene feels theatrical. Stage lights, shifting curtains of mist, roaring applause from the sea. You're the only audience member, or perhaps the actor, depending on perspective. Historians still argue whether keepers found isolation theatrical, poetic, or purely oppressive. You decide it's all three, depending on the hour. Sometime past midnight, you think you hear a horn distant, low, carried on the wind. You listen hard, ears straining against the howl of gusts, but hear nothing else. Fringe accounts tell of phantom ships, horns echoing through fog with no vessel visible. Historians dismiss most of these as imagination or acoustic tricks, yet the story lives on in logbooks. You scribble the note down just in case, and the act itself feels like participation in the folklore of your profession. Maybe future keepers will read your words and nod knowingly, recognizing the sound you cannot prove. Dawn approaches, slower tonight, and the horizon glows faintly. The flames are still steady, your eyes gritty with fatigue, yet your chest fills with a curious pride. The night has passed without disaster, and though no sailor will know your name, the ships that glide safely by owe part of their journey to your stubborn wakefulness. You extinguish the lanterns one by one, each flame bowing out quietly, like an actor after curtain call. The chamber dims, grows quiet, until only smoke curls upward, leaving the glass panes smeared and in need of another day's polish. You sigh, half amusement, half resignation, and whisper, "See you tonight." The lighthouse breathes into silence. Waves continue their endless percussion, gulls return to their screeching commentary, and daylight floods the chamber. You descend once more, steps measured, weary but grounded. Routine awaits, cleaning, logging, preparing for another cycle. Historians still argue whether this monotony crushed or strengthened those who endured it. You decide it is both crushing in its repetition, strengthening in its purpose. And so you go on, hands blackened with soot, body swaying with the rhythm of stone and sea, life stitched into cycles of flame, fog, and endurance. Now the wind down comes, softer, slower, quieter, your words melting like wax. You let the imagery loosen, let the tower dissolve into mist. The lantern flames blur into drifting stars. The spiral staircase unwinds into a ribbon that leads nowhere. And the sea's roar softens into a steady, calming hum. You rest in the glow of quiet persistence, the notion that even the smallest flame held steady against endless darkness matters. And as your breathing slows, you let yourself trust that the tower stands firm, that the lanterns burn steady, that your weary watch is enough. The night drifts gently away. The horizon eases into calm, and you find yourself folding into sleep. The light still steady in memory, carrying you onward toward dreams.